Some schools only require the GRE if your GPA is lower. Some schools don't have any GRE requirement, but it doesn't mean that's going to hurt you to take the GRE if your GPA is low. Meaning maybe they don't have that requirement to take the GRE if your GPA is below a certain threshold, but maybe your GPA is a 3.2 and you're like, will it help me? They don't require the GRE.
Hey, future CRNA, welcome to the CSBA podcast. CSBA has helped over 3,000 nurses like you gain acceptance into schools across the country. Tune in for inspiration and actionable takeaways to help you from start to finish.
Hello, future CRNA. Welcome back to CSB podcast. Today, we're going to talk about the GRE and should you take it? Do you have to take it? And then if you do have to take it, how do we break that down? How do you know what's a competitive score? And what are CRNA schools really looking for when it comes to taking the GRE? So without further ado, let's get into today's episode. I'm Jenny Finnell, founder of CRNA School Prep Academy and practicing CRNA. And I haven't touched on this topic in a while about the GRE, and a lot has changed over the last couple of years when it comes to not only the test itself, but CRNA schools and their requirements around the GRE. So we're going to go ahead and give this a good old update, and I have an exciting offer for you, which is a practice test, a free practice test from today's sponsor, Magoosh. So be sure to stay tuned to learn how you can get a hold of that test. And let's go ahead and start breaking down what is it about the GRE that you should know as you embark upon applying to CRNA school. So first and foremost, I think, this is a standardized test that CRNA schools historically always required, but in the last several years, a lot of them have now moved away from this requirement. And then others have maybe not moved fully away from the requirement, and maybe that they only require it for a certain GPA. And we're going to discuss that in further detail. So again, when it comes to the GRE, you're looking at verbal and quantitative as well as a writing portion. And some key points is that, again, the schools that require the GPA or the GRE for a GPA, that's going to vary. For example, Marquette requires the GRE if you have a 3 or below a 3.2, while a program like MUSC requires the GRE if your GPA is below a 3.6. So that's a pretty wide range of requirements based on GPA alone. So just know that if you're like, oh, my GPA is a 3.4, you may or may not still have to take the GRE. So I guess the lesson learned here is don't make the assumption that your GPA is good enough to avoid taking this test. And it's always best to look into this early on so you can give yourself adequate amount of time to prepare for this test. And I'm going to share some tips on how to do that. And again, we're going to get into some more details around that. I do have a comprehensive list. If you're a CSBA member, there is a comprehensive list of schools that do not require the GRE. I always encourage you, though, to check out the school's websites because this changes. And so you have to make sure you're staying up to date by visiting the school's websites and looking up this information, depending on what school you're going to be applying to. All right. So what is new on the GRE? So the GRE is now 1 hour and 58 minutes long. Believe it or not, you're like, oh, that's so long. But that is actually cut in half from the old format. So it was a real nasty, lengthy test. And so they're a little bit kinder now. It's a little bit shorter. It's still a relatively long test. So 1 hour and 58 minutes. So, you essentially can plot your butt down in that chair for a couple hours for this test. And kind of how you break this GRE formatting down. Like I said earlier, you'll have an analytical writing. And again, that is about 30 minutes of the test itself. And they ask you to analyze an issue and you write about that. The next section is verbal reasoning, and this is actually broken into two different sections. Section 1 is about 18 minutes, and section 2 of this is about 23 minutes. And then you have your quantitative reasoning, which is 2 sections as well. One is, again, about 21 minutes, and the other one is 26 minutes long. And anywhere section 1 is 12 questions, section 2 is 15 questions. Let's break this down a little bit further. The analytical writing, again, schools now care a lot about analytical writing. Back when I took the GRE, it wasn't as relevant because I went for my master's, there wasn't as much, there was writing, don't get me wrong, you had to know how to write. But now that you have a doctoral thesis that you're going to be working on and you're going to be writing a lot of research papers, the analytical writing is becoming more and more important for schools. And so historically, back when I took it, sometimes they just wanted to see the average. And maybe that was a 3.5 to 4. And now they're looking at requiring at least a 4 to 4.5 on your writing. So again, if you got a 3.5, that's really below average. And so a lot of schools are not going to look very highly on that score. So again, you really should be aiming for at least a 4, if not a 4.5 on your analytical writing. The verbal reasoning, this one I find to be really hard to improve quickly because it really has to do with your vocabulary and comprehension of reading, which is hard to do in a short period of time. So if you're like me and you struggle with that, plan accordingly and make sure that you're tackling this very early on before you take the GRE, because it takes a lot of time to build up that type of knowledge. And again, you want to make sure you want to score at least average. And I'm going to go over what those scores would look like. And then you have your quantitative reasoning. This one's really, really key for the GRE and for CRNA school because it's math-based. And CRNA school, as you probably have heard, is a very heavy science curriculum, including understanding basic math. And so the quantitative reasoning is really critical to a science-based education that you're going into in CRNA school. So you really want to be scoring above average in your quantitative reasoning. Average is definitely the minimum, but above average will definitely be something that will play in your favor when it comes to applying to CRNA school and being more competitive. And last, there is a 10-minute break after the third section if you wish to take that break. All right, so let's get more into CRNA school requirements when it comes to the GRE test. Again, some schools have a minimum requirement. Some say it's a 295, while others say 300. That being said, the majority of schools state the 300 as the minimum requirement. There are a few schools who state 298, 295, but again, that's very few schools. The majority require at least 300, and some are now moving to a 305 as the minimum. And there's a reason for that, but that, again, you're going to have to really research your schools and understand what the minimum requirement is. And just know that I have a lot of students who are like, okay, Jenny, my minimum is 300 at a 299 or 298, are they still going to accept that test? I can't give you a 100% answer on that. You're going to have to contact your school and see how important that score is to move forward in the application process. Some schools are like, it's a hard rule that absolutely not. You have to meet that threshold or the answer is no, just like the GPA threshold. Other schools tend to be a little more lenient. And so it's different than other requirements of CRNA school because, like, for example, GPA, that's a pretty hard requirement. Meaning if you don't meet the GPA requirement, not too many schools are going to evaluate your application at all. But the GRE can be a little different. Some schools, they don't necessarily weight it as heavily as something like GPA. And if you just miss the cutoff of the threshold and you have a really good application overall otherwise, they may tell you to go ahead and just proceed with the application. While other schools will say, no, sorry, that's a requirement. If you can't meet it, then take it again and apply after you meet that minimum. So just know that that can vary from school to school. And if you're kind of in that limbo land where you're not really sure what to do and you just missed the cutoff, just reach out and ask so you know how to proceed. As far as competitive scores for GRE and CRNA school, historically, I would say a 305 is a relatively competitive score, but anymore, with that being more of the average score of a GRE, competitive score on the GRE is now upwards of 310 plus. So again, not that you need to score a 310 or higher to be competitive. A 305 is still really good. Getting a 300 or 298 really is not competitive in the big scheme of things. So at minimum, to have a competitive GRE score, you should be aiming at a 305 or higher to make it so your score stands out. And then kind of back to what I already mentioned, some schools only require the GRE if your GPA is lower. Some schools don't have any GRE requirement, but it doesn't mean it's going to hurt you to take the GRE if your GPA is low. Meaning maybe they don't have that requirement to take the GRE if your GPA is below a certain threshold, but maybe your GPA is a 3.2 and you're like, will it help me? They don't require the GRE. That's, again, kind of a gray area that I encourage you to go to open houses to talk to program faculty about. Typically, what I can advise you on, this is just kind of an overall big picture. You can't make up for a low GPA by taking the GRE, but if you've already tried to make up for your low GPA and it's not really budging, taking the GPA can be a nice addition to kind of help bolster that effort. But you still want to make sure you're putting effort into improving your GPA and not ignoring it and taking the GRE instead. Let me just say that one more time to make sure that's clear. If you have a GPA of a 3.2 science GPA, let's just say a 3.2, and you're like, I don't really want to take any more science classes, I'll just take the GRE instead. That's not necessarily equivalent. So you'd be better off taking a science course first and getting an A And if it still doesn't really budge your GPA a whole lot, maybe it only budges it to 3.25 and you're like, ah, boo, that stinks. Well, at that point, then it may be still worthwhile to take the GRE to kind of help bolster that effort that you already gave to improving your GPA. But before you go sign up for our courses in GRE, please connect with open houses, connect with the program faculty. Be very specific and brief and concise when you reach out to these programs. If you give them open-ended questions, you're not going to get as good of an answer. So make sure you're very specific about, this is what I plan to do. Is this going to help me, or would you recommend another process to help improve my competitive nature of my application? So it's always worthwhile to make sure you're getting that kind of feedback. If you're a part of CSBA, I do weekly coaching with our students. So I hope to see you on one of those sessions, because this is hard. This is really hard to kind of navigate. So that's what I have to say about dealing with low GPAs and the GRE. Okay, so let's get into national averages. This has changed, you guys, and it's getting higher. I don't know if it's because of the way they reformatted the test or what. This looks like it's like shifting upwards compared to what it used to be even just a couple years ago. So the average GRE score across all test takers has shifted from the new GRE style. And that's probably, again, related to the change in the test. So verbal now is at 152 as the 50th percentile. So again, verbal average across the board is 152. So again, if you score 152 on verbal, I'd say you're doing that. That's cool. That's good. I mean, if you got a little bit higher than that, great, but I wouldn't worry about being a brainiac in verbal. Don't get me wrong. It's not going to hurt anything if you are, but I would rather see that brainiac come out in the quantitative section. So I would just say aim for average on the verbal or slightly above. So 153, 154, and then, slightly above the 152 benchmark threshold. And then for the quantitative, the 50th percentile is between 156 and 157. Scoring 156 on the quantitative is the 49th percentile, and scoring 157 is in the 52nd percentile. So you can see now that a combined score of 308, 309 will put you slightly above average, which is why I think we're seeing some schools push that 300 minimum up to 305 minimum, because technically 305 is now really the new standard average for the test. So that is why scoring above a 305 is really how you can make yourself stand out a little bit more, is make yourself a slightly more competitive by doing above average. So that is, again, kind of the new averages for the test. So again, if you're taking the quantitative, I would aim to get at least a 162. If the 52nd percentile is 157, getting between a 157 and a 164 would really be ideal for the quantitative section to really boost your competitive nature of the GRE. And then if you aimed for the average verbal score. So again, to definitely put you above a 305. So those are my recommendations for how you should try to aim when you're practicing and preparing for the test to get these scores. It's really hard when you're taking practice tests to know, is this really how I'm going to score on the real test? But I can promise you, the more you take practice tests, the better idea you're going to get at what ballpark you're going to fall into when you take the real test. And excitingly enough, Magoosh, their practice test, which is free, which I'm going to give to you, you can find it in the link. You can pause this right now and grab it. It's going to be in the show notes, the link for the free practice test. Is that, again, the more you practice these tests, the better you're going to score. And Magoosh gives you real questions, meaning it's the only test prep company that actually has real questions in their practice prep. So again, it's going to give you a really good indicator on how you're performing before you take the real test. I would advise you, since it's one test, to kind of take some other practice tests first and save this big, juicy, good one for right before. So not right before, give yourself time in case you have to keep studying. But I wouldn't go into this test cold, is what I'm trying to say. Do some prep prior to taking this test. I know historically from talking to you, that sometimes I hear students say, Jenny, I'm just going to wing it, see how I do. And if I don't do well, then I'll study. And it's like, oh, that hurts me so bad, because it's a huge confidence blow when you don't do well, right? And you're like, oh, that stinks. I only got a 290. I have a long way to go. And not to mention it's time and expensive to take the test more than once. So don't do that to yourself. Promise me, you're going to prepare, you're going to study. And when you do, take this free practice test, see where you lie, and then go back, hit the books again if you need to prepare more. Okay, let's get into the analytical writing section a little bit more. So again, CRNA schools typically are now requiring at least a 4, ideally 4.5 on the analytical writing. And just to give you an idea of where the averages lie, a 3.5 is actually in the 38th percentile. And I'm going to laugh at that because that's where I was. This was like back, I don't know. I mean, I probably took that test in 2000. Either way, I took the test back in 2010, 2011, something along those lines. But yeah, I scored a 3.5. And that was hard for me. And that's currently in the 38th percentile. So a 4, if you scored a 4, I'll have to give you some confidence boosting here because I'm a CRNA. So if you score a 4, that's in the 55th percentile. So if you scored a 4.5, you're doing exceptionally well. So don't beat yourself up if you get a 4, that's good. But you definitely want to try to do better than a 3.5 on the analytical writing. And unfortunately, to do this, the best way is to just practice, you guys. It's just practice. And so again, Magoosh can support you in that. So I highly encourage you to just buckle down and practice if it's something you're struggling with. Let's get into asking that hard question, like, should you take it? Should you not take it? And a lot of students I find are struggling with this because they just want to know how they can be more competitive overall. So even if it's not required, they're like kind of debating, and I think now that the test is shorter, of course that makes it a little bit more sustained. I mean, instead of a 3-hour test, now I guess it was over a 3-hour test before. Now it's a 2-hour test. But again, it's a little bit easier, but it's still a very hard test to take. And it's also time consuming and expensive. So, I think to weigh your options, I think first, again, like I said before, addressing a low GPA by addressing the low GPA versus trying to compensate through other means. I think looking at your application as a whole, how much ICU experience do you have? What kind of ICU experience do you have? What kind of leadership roles do you have? How does your science GPA break down from your overall GPA? Have you been to program open houses? Have you talked to current students? Have you been to any conferences? How overall competitive do you think you are? And I think once you kind of analyze that, you can then make a better decision going forward on the GRE if you just wanted to take it just to take it. Now, of course, if it's required, then you have to take it. If it's only required based on a GPA, then again, that's also kind of a gray area because you may have to take it based on your GPA, but you may also be wondering, well, should I just take it though? And I think that really depends on what your timeline is, right? I think a lot of students, I see them try to bite off more than they can chew. And sometimes that kind of comes back to bite them a little bit because they're doing the CCRN, they're taking the GRE, they're taking an advanced pathophysiology course. And then maybe their grade in the pathophysiology course isn't so great because they're just studying for so many different things at once and working full time. So be very careful. That is why I always advise you, if you're thinking about becoming a CRNA, the sooner you start planning, the better, because the longer runway you give yourself, the better to start kind of tackling some of these tasks without trying to cram it all in right before the application is due. All right. So again, if your GPA is on the lower side, it may be worth considering if you've already tried to make up for that and it hasn't been super beneficial or really budged your GPA much. And again, kind of considering where your school's minimum threshold lies, whether that's a 300, 305, or 298. So you can kind of make your game plan on where you want your ultimate score to be. I can share some about my personal experience with the GRE. I had to take it more than once. And I did prepare for that first one. I just didn't do well. I don't do great with standardized testing in general. That's always been a weakness of mine. I have had to historically find a lot of unique ways to take tests that I can comprehend. I've always had a reading comprehension issue since I was a child. And it's probably partially due to dyslexia, amongst other things, who knows? But I've had to find kind of unique strategies when I take a test to help my brain comprehend what they're asking for. And I tend to still have the tendency to flip things around a little bit and reverse words and put words in there that don't exist and things like that. So I have to be really careful when I read and reread. But that being said, my first attempt, I scored it in the ballpark. I don't remember the exact number, but it was below a 300. It was like between a 295 and 298, somewhere around those lines. It was pretty close. At the time, I was looking at applying to a school who required a 300, and I had just missed that threshold. So I reached out, like I'm encouraging you guys to do. And they just kind of, at the time, it was a program coordinator, and they laughed at me over the phone and said, honey, if you can't achieve that minimum score, you shouldn't bother applying. And I was like, wow, that was really harsh to kind of take it in such a derogatory tone. I wanted to be like, have you taken that test? What did you score? But of course I didn't. I kind of just put my tail between my legs and said, okay, thank you. And then I was like, well, I guess I got to take this test again. I got to figure out how to do better. And now that being said, so I had also other applications coming up that I needed the test for. Back when I was preparing for CRNA school, the test was almost required from all CRNA programs. It was kind of unique to not require it. where that has definitely changed today. But that being said, I invested heavily in a tutoring resource, and I just did tons and tons of prep with the quantitative. My verbal was kind of right around the average, maybe slightly below, but right around the average mark. And I was like, okay, am I really going to improve that? Probably not. That's never been my strong suit. I can be good at, I can excel in math. I'm still struggling in it, but I can excel when I really put a lot of effort into it. So that's kind of what I doubled down on, is really focusing on my quantitative score, which I was able to get that to, like, it was like 165 or 166. It was much higher than what it was when I first took it. So that dramatically improved. Yeah, it worked. And so I always tell people, don't be afraid to invest in test prep, because it just will help you and not stress you out any more than you already have to be. All right. So here are some tips when going into the GRE. Knowing your baseline. And this is kind of when it comes down to taking that practice test, which again, if you haven't grabbed it yet, it's in the show notes. Grab it now, pause the episode. It's a free practice test by Magoosh, who is today's sponsor. Thank you, Magoosh. And it's for you. And I encourage you to prepare before you use this free test, because you want to see, after you prepare, what is your baseline? You understand that baseline is really, really critical when it comes to going into that test. So you kind of have a gauge on how you're going to do and what it is you need to do prior to taking the test, so you can put the odds in your favor to perform and get the score that you want to score. Understand where your strengths and your weaknesses are. And so identifying what areas of the test you need to put more time and attention into. And kind of like what I spoke to, my verbal was relatively average. So not that I didn't have to not that I had to ignore that and not review it, but I knew my quantitative, I knew I could improve that with some practice. I mean, some of this math, you guys, was math that I hadn't done since high school or maybe earlier. And like geometry, I hate that stuff. And so I'm like, okay, Jenny, just do it. You gotta refresh yourself. You gotta reteach yourself. And honestly, what I thought was actually kind of refreshing was I enjoyed learning it myself, and I did not like trying to learn it from someone else. Like when I was trying to be taught that kind of stuff, I remember really struggling. But when I went back in myself and retaught it to myself when I was preparing for the GRE, I was able to get it much quicker. And who knows, because I've already seen it before, or if I knew my study techniques better, or I just was stronger as far as being able to teach myself information than I was when I was back in high school. So don't shy away from it too much. Rest assured that you may find it's easier to get that information back, even though it's been several years since you've learned it. So again, I am here to kind of call to action is to grab that free test. And again, Magoosh sponsored this video, which we're really grateful for. And I also want to share some other tidbits about Magoosh that I think are going to be really helpful for you in choosing Magoosh as your testing partner. So they have helped millions. That's insane. I wish I could say I've helped millions of ICU nurses someday I will, but they've helped millions of students prep for the GRE. So they have the experience, they have the knowledge, they know what they need to do to help students be successful. They have fully updated their test to the new shorter GRE version. And like I said, it's the only test prep company that includes the official GRE materials and questions, and it emphasizes importance of practicing with official questions because, again, it stimulates the real test experience, which is what you want. And I also think that they have an unbeatable price. They're actually cheaper than most competitors out there. So again, I think that's a big bonus for you. Keep some cash in your pockets. And they also have the most ambitious score improvement guarantee. This is really key. And I've talked about this before, but you want to pick a test prep company that gives you a guarantee of a better outcome. So again, they guarantee a 5+ score increase or your money back. So that I think is really key, especially if you're faced with having to retake that darn test. And if you go with a test prep company that gives you a guarantee, you know you're going to get the results you want or you get your money back. So again, I think that's huge. It gives you peace of mind that if you're going to put more time and effort and money into something, that you're going to get the results you want or you get your money back, which is also why CSBA offers a guarantee. So again, picking guarantees is a real surefire way to say they're holding themselves accountable to give you good results. It includes 1,600 questions, full-length tests. They also have smart feedback and progress tracking to turn your weaknesses into strengths. They have email assistance, and you can take this anywhere. You can do it from your app. You can log in from your desktop. So it's a real convenient way. You can prep on the go. A lot of you are on travel assignments or things of that nature. So you can pop open your app and study as you're on the road or doing laundry or cooking dinner. So I hope you guys will find this helpful. My goal is always to help you succeed. So I wish you the best in your GRE endeavors. be sure to grab the Magoosh free GRE test. The link is down below. And thank you again, Magoosh, for supporting us and this episode. All right, till next time, take care.
Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to head over to CRNA School Prep Academy.com to gather free resources to help you on your CRNA journey. Stay strong. We're rooting for you, future CRNA.